Commie Blocks are pretty good actually, is a video made by Adam Something where he brings up good sides of these dystopian looking buildings, such as alleviating the housing crisis and modernizing Eastern Europe. Although there is truth to these claims, Commie Blocks also have a much darker side to them, which I like to explore in this video. Currently, we're living in a housing crisis with rent costing more than my 2 kidneys combined. Which, considering the amount of alcohol I've drank in my lifetime, isn't surprising. But even so, a fully healthy kidney isn't too far off from the price of a 1-bedroom apartment in Toronto. As a result, many have started to look towards Eastern Europe and the infamous Commie Block as some sort of solution. Because under socialism, housing was free and you'd get a complimentary state-sponsored kiss on the forehead upon moving into your new apartment. Or did you? No, you definitely didn't get any sloppy kisses from Stalin. But the origin of these apartments comes from him. In the 1920s, after the communists finally enacted their revolution instead of just writing about it on Reddit, one of the first acts of business was to tackle industrialization. For years, Russia had been lagging behind the West when it came to polluting the earth for the sake of making labubus. As such, most of the country's population lived outside of cities, and about 80%. When Stalin came to power, he said, "Enough with the fresh air nonsense, it was time to get some blood in our bloodstreams." So, plans for new factories and industries were put into motion, and millions of people were to be relocated to the cities to work in said factories. But there was a problem. There were no houses for these people. They needed lots of them, and fast. "Comrade Stalin, what are we going to do? We have 50,000 people coming to Moscow this week, and we're short 40,000 apartments. Can't you see I'm trying to think? Leave me in peace." "Vadim, I got it!" So, Stalin revved up the concrete mixers, mass-producing concrete panels and assembling them into big-ass concrete blocks to create new apartments. Revolutionary at the time, sure, but this plan had many flaws. First and foremost, although these new buildings were produced incredibly efficiently, and for the Soviet equivalent of dime on the dollar, they sucked. The concrete used to make them was of poor quality, and most of the panels were quite thin. Soundproofing was virtually non-existent, so you could easily hear Dmitry arguing with his wife at 2 in the morning over his borscht being cold. But that wasn't his wife's fault, but the buildings, as because of the poor material, insulation of the apartments was dreadful. Heat wasn't able to be retained properly at all, and water leaks weren't uncommon either. Fun fact, because of the poor insulation, many Eastern European apartments would have a lot of large carpets on their floor and walls in an effort to retain heat. It's also worth mentioning that throughout Stalin's time on this earth, the man was still not met. The USSR was still just beginning to industrialize, and most of these new government-built apartments were only given to high echelons of society, aka big boy party members and managers. As a result, families had to live in one apartment, with each family being assigned to one room. All household members were living in cramped living quarters and would only have access to one bathroom and one kitchen. Can you imagine 18 people living in a 50-meter squared concrete box? Well, that was the reality for many at the time. Now, I know many who defend Commie Blocks will argue saying, yeah, they sucked and people were cramped, but they provided modern housing when people needed it most. And you're right to an extent. But here's the thing. The industrialization that occurred in the Soviet Union and its satellite states was forced. The demand for housing skyrocketed because hundreds of thousands, hell, even millions, were forcefully relocated to cities to work in factories. On top of that, the USSR also ethnically displaced non-Russians from minority-dominated states, sending them to Siberia and bringing in Russians to take their place. This was a prominent issue in Latvia. Many Latvian families following the second Soviet occupation were exiled to a work camp in the Far East. After returning, they would find that their houses had been seized by the state and would find several other families living in them. In a lot of cases, Russian families, or state-sponsored squatters, as I like to call them. In Riga, most newly built apartments were prioritized to non-Latvian immigrants, while the locals would have to wait approximately 25 years for an apartment of their own. And a similar situation occurred in Transylvania, with many Hungarians being deported to other parts of the country, while Romanians were brought into the cities and prioritized when it came to housing. By the time Stalin moved in with Hitler in the underworld, the Soviet Union was able to industrialize pretty decently. But to be fair, the two of them probably had a lot to discuss. It's a shame they didn't speak the same language though. But they could have if they used FluentU. FluentU is an app and website that makes the language learning experience much more enjoyable and seamless by using real videos like movies and TV shows, music videos, news clips, you know, stuff you'd actually want to watch. I can get interactive subtitles, and if I don't know a word, just hover over it, and FluentU instantly gives me the definition, an image, pronunciation, example sentences, and even shows me other videos where that word is used. It's incredible for building vocabulary naturally. And get this, they have a Chrome extension that lets me do the same thing on Netflix movies and shows. Bada bing bada boom, I'm able to watch Arcane in Russian and learn from it at the same time. Or I can do the same with YouTube videos that have subtitles. You can even scroll through the app's curated video libraries suitable for beginner and intermediate level learners. Currently, FluentU supports 10 languages, including Russian and German, making it perfect for the two biggest dictators of the 20th century if they wish to throw insults at each other in the language they could actually understand.
Let me put it in a language you can understand.
So, instead of watching anime in Japanese, which is so 2013, you could watch it like God intended, in Russian. It's not just about watching content and looking up words. If I'd want to really hone in on learning languages efficiently, FluentU has this really smart review system with quizzes that builds me up from understanding words to actually forming sentences. It's available on web, iOS, and Android too. Click the link in the description to get a free 14-day trial and a 40% discount after. If you're serious about mastering a language and want a way to stay motivated using authentic content, I can't recommend FluentU more. It's a true game changer for learning any language. So don't waste any time and check out FluentU today. Khrushchev, his successor, decided to tackle the housing problem himself, declaring that one apartment per family is a state priority. So, in the 50s, Khrushchev put on track pants he could afford to get some paint on, put on his Baustelle gloves on, and fired up the concrete mixer himself. As shit as Stalin's buildings were, Khrushchev outdid him, making them somehow even worse. Less material, less details, more blocks. The buildings came to be known as Khrushchevkas, aka Khrushchev's houses, but others also refer to them as Khrushchoba, meaning Khrushchev's slum. These new buildings consisted of 4 to 5 floors, where the max apartment size was 55 meters squared and had between 1 to 3 rooms. The idea was to cram as many apartments into one building as possible, and for each family member to have between 9 to 12 meters squared of so-called living space. And although in quality and design they were more depressing than Stalin's, they still managed to smell like cabbage before anyone moved in. So, a big W if you're a cabbage lover. Khrushchev was ultimately successful with his plan, and millions were successfully relocated to their own apartment, decreasing the number of people living in communal housing. However, although individual families were provided with a place of their own, once they moved in, they were stuck with what they got. The government ultimately owned the apartments and not the families. As such, you still had to pay rent. But to be fair, it was pretty low. usually 4 to 10% of one's paycheck. Ultimately, it was the government's say who gets what, which again was dependent on the household members' standing in the party and what work they did. Moving to a different apartment was a complicated and tedious process that often took years. You could obtain an apartment of your own if within your current one, each family member had less than 5 meters squared of living space, there were 2 members of the opposite sex over 18 and weren't spouses, and were living in the same room. Upon meeting these conditions, one could apply for relocation. But this didn't mean necessarily getting your own place. A lot of the time, a room within a communal apartment would be assigned to the applicant instead. In cities in the European part of the Soviet Union, the time to realize an application would take between 10 to 15 years. But even if you were applying from a more rural area like a town in Siberia, it would take between 2 to 5. Meaning that if you applied to move out from your parents when you just turned 18, you would only be able to do so once you were well into your 30s. Newlywed couples bypassed the system by exchanging their living arrangements with new divorcees, with a small under-the-table exchange, of course. Some housing came directly from industrial plants. For example, if you got a job at a steel mill, the company would provide you with an apartment, but losing the job meant losing the home. Some industries also offered dormitories, where workers shared rooms with 2 to 4 people. Each dormitory floor could house 40 to 100 workers, with shared kitchens and bathrooms. Private housing existed too, especially in rural areas and small towns, where the government had little involvement. Families often kept their own homes, and it was possible to build one yourself with government approval. However, all construction costs had to be covered personally, and much of the labor was usually done by the homeowners themselves. Those who owned their own homes were also allowed to rent out rooms to tenants. Moving cities was a complicated process. If you wished to move from, say, Moscow to, let's say Irkutsk, you needed to first get a job there. But to get a job, you would need a residency permit by having an apartment there. But again, you couldn't get an apartment without a job. Essentially, a communist catch-22 situation. So those who wished to move to a new place would often rent out a room from a private landlord, which is a bit ironic considering landlords were considered the ultimate evil by communists. Lastly, there was also an option of purchasing your own apartment via a cooperative. You could take out a loan from the cooperative and purchase your own apartment. The down payment would range between 5 to 30% of your total cost. The rest was to be paid out over several years in monthly rates, which to an extent were subsidized by the government. But due to the high costs, this only remained an option to Soviet elites and those with connections in the cooperatives who could bypass the incredibly long queues. The housing policy was changed again with the arrival of Brezhnev. Between the mid-60s up until the 80s, giant 16-story plus commie blocks came into existence. Their design was experimented with. Different shades of color, less bland facades, different geometric shapes, better insulation, and alternatives to smelling like cabbage were implemented. And most importantly, they had elevators, which previous generations of commie blocks did not. This was a crucial development as many old folks struggled with leaving their apartments due to having to climb up and down several stories. All in all, these developments coincided with the stabilization of the Eastern Bloc's economic situation. Most iconic and weird-looking brutalist buildings were constructed in this time period in an effort to give the cities some actual landmarks instead of just a sea of copy-pasted gray blocks. But again, most of the apartments in these cool-looking buildings were provided to elites and those with nepotic connections. And ultimately, this was a big problem with commie blocks. For a regime that claimed it was here to provide a classless society, corruption and nepotism were the decisive factor in one's living arrangements, and in some cases, ethnicity was too. If you were a member of the working class, you were forced to live in sardine-like conditions, while someone who cheered Khrushchev's every sneeze like it was a standing ovation was rewarded with a private estate. Secondly, a lot of historic cities like Bucharest, Novi Sad, and Warsaw had entire segments filled with beautiful historic buildings that spanned centuries, demolished and replaced with ugly gray monotone blocks devoid of soul and personality. This can be best seen with the building of the People's Palace in Bucharest. Most of the old town, for which the city got the name Paris of the East, was leveled to the ground to erect this monstrosity. On the Unity Boulevard that leads up to it, numerous extravagant commie blocks were erected which housed the highest government elites of Romania, which is disgusting considering the whole basis of socialist and communist ideology was equality and the demolishing of class structure. But symbols of the bourgeoisie were destroyed only to be replaced with symbols of the new society's bourgeoisie. A defense for commie blocks is that many of these historic buildings and most housing in general was destroyed during the Second World War. And that is true. After the war, people across Europe needed housing, and they needed it fast. And these blocks were meant to be a solution for this problem, which they definitely did help with. Arguably, they tackled the issue better than alternatives in Western Europe. However, commie blocks were originally envisioned as a temporary solution until the countries could stand up on their feet, but ended up as a permanent one instead. Much of Western Europe was also undergoing a severe housing crisis after the war. Homelessness was a major issue in countries like the UK, Germany, and the Soviet Union. And although the USSR did make a monumental step with the building of commie blocks to solve this problem, so did Western European states, who also invested heavily into social housing and housing subsidies. Prefabs made by the UK are the best example. Similar to what the Soviets were doing, the British erected hundreds of thousands of cheaply made temporary apartments and new towns to house refugees from the war. But as the country strengthened economically, they were replaced with better permanent homes. However, homelessness did prevail as an issue in the west of the continent for some time after the war. But this was the case in the Eastern Bloc as well. A common misconception is that the Soviet Union eradicated homelessness with the construction of commie blocks. This isn't the case. Officially, the USSR denied the existence of homelessness as a whole and listed it as a crime, because its existence would undermine the claim that socialism guarantees basic needs. But following the years after the war, it persisted as production of apartments could not reach demand. People without a residency permit would be arrested or sentenced to forced labor. Ex-convicts from work camps often didn't have anywhere to go after their release, and those who wished to move to another city had to come up with creative solutions due to the difficulties of obtaining a residency permit, like sleeping in basements and train stations. Lastly, there was the issue of orphans. Many kids who lost their parents during the war or were abandoned by them, as was the case in socialist Romania, were homeless. The state would place them in overcrowded orphanages, from which many escaped, send them to labor colonies and special schools. It is true that homelessness was treated as a crime in the USSR, but it was treated the same way as addiction is treated in the United States. All in all, commie blocks were a necessary evil at the time. They did provide a lot of relief to those displaced by the war and helped with the general housing crisis. However, they were severely mismanaged, promoted corruption and nepotism, and destroyed cultural heritage and limited liberty of movement and class mobility. As such, it is important to be aware of their dark past and negative symbol they present to many in Eastern Europe.